collaboration with the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory coming from the University of Belgrade in Serbia, Federal University of Pernambuco in Brazil, and the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil as well. So it is also, we can say, maybe a kind of a founding moment of a new theoretical group at the Institute, which we have founded at the Laboratory for Social Critique, called the Theory on the Semi-Periphery and the Periphery. In a way, I'm very glad to introduce this as well. Today, my honor is to moderate the first panel titled Beyond Canonical Theory, which will have 3 presentations. Each one will be around 30 minutes, and then we will have a 30-minute discussion. So I can introduce our first speaker, which is Andrea Perunovic, right? You're speaking first, okay. Andrea Perunovic is a research fellow at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, so my colleague. He started his PhD studies in the Philosophy, Art and Critical Theory division of the European Graduate School and obtained his doctoral degree in philosophy from University Paris 8. His dissertation, directed by François Nudelman, is titled Archaeology of Trust, Prolegomena of a Distrustful Thought, and his current research focuses on intersectional spaces between philosophy, psychoanalytic theory, and contemporary Francophone thought. And Andrea's presentation is titled The Universal and the Semi-Peripheral, Notes Toward a Peninsular Thinking. So, Andrea, you can take the field. You have 30 minutes.
Thank you, Milan. Hello, everyone. And so, if you permit, I will start just by admitting that it is a bit of a daunting task to kick off this event, but it is above all an honor and a joy to be amongst you today and to exchange together, hopefully for the first of the many times that are to come. So, without wasting too much time, so as Milan said, the title of my talk is The Universal and the Semi-Peripheral, Notes Toward the Peninsular Thought or Thinking. This word peninsular, from the title, refers, as you might have guessed already, as might you have noted, to the Balkan Peninsula. So basically, I will be talking today to you about Balkans, about the Balkans and the world, about the Balkans in the world, and about what the experience of the Balkans could bring to the world, thus purveying a certain lived experience, a material testimony of the semi-colonial, semi-modern, and semi-peripheral phenomena that take place on the wretched peninsula of Europe that are the Balkans. But let's begin with few thoughts on the notion of the universal, of course, without abandoning our initial perspective. So throughout the long and intrinsically Western history of the notion of universal, many of its conceptual forms have seen their rise and their fall on the stage of philosophy. From the classical definitions brought by Plato and Aristotle through Christianity, all the way to Descartes, then Kant, Hegel, Marx, and finally to contemporary debates, the topos of universal have always been a pivotal point around which were organized some of the key philosophical concepts. Nevertheless, in the last decades of the 20th century, the universal gradually became a dirty word in the Western philosophical and theoretical discourses. The regimes of being and knowing that the idea of universal was enacting became predominantly considered as inadequate to respond to the issues of the contemporary world and its political conjunctures. Obviously, there were some objective historical reasons for that trend. The conceptual violence of the European universalism that has fueled the imperial and the colonial politics of Europe throughout the history has made a tremendous damage across the world. This is best explained and demonstrated, to my view, in Immanuel Wallerstein's important little book entitled European Universalism, The Rhetoric of Power. So the decision of Western intellectuals to somehow abandon universalism wasn't senseless, of course, given the history of violence that has been committed in the name of universal causes and values. But it was nevertheless a mistake, because Western philosophy has thereafter turned its head away from the universal, as if its material consequences would cease thus to exist. And they didn't. They were simply pushed to the periphery of knowledge, while staying nonetheless a substantial part of a shared common reality. The symbolic realm of the universal was thus repressed, becoming a kind of a Balkans of the European thought, if you wish. From then onwards, a specter was haunting the European thought, a specter of the universal. As we know very well from Shakespeare to Derrida, a specter, a ghost, is something that returns by its very definition. So, almost right from the start, from the very beginning of repression of the universal, but most notably with the beginning of the 21st century, we have witnessed to a peculiar and rather welcome, I would say, return of the repressed. And just like Freud shows in Moses and Monotheism, the returning elements always undergo through extensive distortion compared with their original form. Critical and decolonial thinkers thus began to question, to reappropriate, and to reformulate the concept of the universal in order to criticize it, but also to give it a fresh start, a new and emancipatory potential. So, let's say more or less directly inspired by Aimé Césaire's idea of a universal, which is, I quote Césaire, rich with all that is particular, rich with all particulars, a universal that enhances, I quote him again, the deepening and coexistence of particulars. Many decolonial thinkers have developed their own concepts of the universal, or of its alternatives, such as the pluriverse or the multiverse. I will just now take a minute to mention a few, like in no particular order. So, amongst the most famous examples are certainly Édouard Glissant's ideas of diversality and the whole world, le tout monde. His philosophy and poetics of relation with the capital R, to which we will come back later on. Then, of course, sorry for now going through some common topos for all researchers interested in decolonial theories, but it will have its point, no? So then there is Enrique Dussels' project on transmodernity, which against the European abstract universality and positive globality that were the conceptual upholds of the European modernity, proposed a non-European, concrete universal, also going by the name of mundialidad. Then we have also famously Walter Mignolo and Catherine Walsh, who instead of a humanist abstract universal, propose relationality or vincularidad, which proceeds, and I quote here the introduction of their book on decoloniality, by creating and eliminating pluriversal and interversal paths that disturb the totality from which the universal and the global are most often perceived. So they're also adopting some kind of a post-humanist stature here. Not so openly, but still. And moreover, there is a recent book of the Senegalese philosopher Souleymane Bachir Diagne entitled Universaliser l'humanité par les moyens de l'humanité, so to universalize humanity by the means of humanity, which advocates for a lateral universal, a concept that he borrows from Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and which he describes as some kind of a horizontal universality, which is based rather on the infinite process of universalizing than on creating determined universal values. Finally, there are some important efforts, of course, to deconstruct the old universalism that are coming from the core philosophical traditions as well. I will mention just here Etienne Balibar's book on universals, where he insists on the plurality, or rather on the equivocity of the universal, underpinning their conflictual mode of existence, which is driven by anthropological differences, one which seems to create conflicts between human beings and conflicts with themselves. Balibar further claims, of course from his neo-Marxist perspective, that universals are always dependent on their specific historical and geographical contexts. For him, their enunciation happens always, sometimes, and somewhere. A complementary argument is to be found in the book Contingency, Hegemony, Universality, Contemporary Dialogues. On the left, co-written some 25 years ago by Judith Butler, Ernesto Laclau, and Slavoj Žižek, where all three authors agree that, I quote, universality is not a static presumption, not an a priori given, and that it is ought instead to be understood as a process or condition irreducible to any of its determinate modes of appearance. This way of taking universals into account is also to be found in Slavoj Žižek's definition of the concrete universal that unsettles from within the identity of the particular, contrarily, of course, to the abstract universal, the classic one, that represent the mute medium of all particular content. Okay. Maybe we can stop here with this overview and get to say a few words about the semi-periphery and about the semi-peripheral, which will advance us in creating possible connections between the two, between the universal on the one hand and the semi-peripheral on the other. It is now more than 50 years ago that Immanuel Wallerstein introduced the notion of the semi-periphery as a crucial concept in his world systems analysis. Back in 1974, in his famous article entitled Dependence in an Interdependent World, the limited possibilities of transformation within the capitalist world economy, he exposed the famous three-model view of the global capitalist economy that divides the global social system of the nations or regions to those who belong economically and politically to the core, to the semi-periphery, and to the periphery. This divide is, as Wallerstein have argued, above all economical, but also political. It is based on the division of labor, the diversity of powers, of production, and the difference between the positions of economic actors in the relations of unequal exchange happening on the so-called free market. In this system, the semi-periphery holds a very peculiar role. I quote Wallerstein. In a system of unequal exchange, the semi-peripheral country stands in between in terms of the kinds of products it exports and in terms of wage levels and profit margins it knows. Furthermore, it trades or seeks to trade in both directions, in one mode with the periphery and in the opposite with the core. And herein lies the singularity of the semi-periphery as opposed both to the periphery and to the core. Okay, now, of course, you know, the relevance and the precision of this economic determination of semi-periphery could be put into question in our contemporary context, given the complexity of diversification of capitalist production in the last 50 years. Yet certainly it cannot be simply discarded. But my focus today won't be strictly on the economic characteristics of the semi-periphery, but rather on its epistemic, anthropological, cultural, and geophilosophical features. Yet, Wallenstein's insight that elucidates the semi-periphery's singularity as being opposed to both the periphery and the core will remain certainly like a central to my argumentation. First, we should see a bit more closely, if you permit, this double opposition. While Wallerstein wrote about an economic opposition that situates the semi-periphery in an antagonistic position both towards the core and to the periphery, in a broader sense, we could propose that the semi-periphery could be understood as a pure counter space, a space in which every position is always already an ambiguous opposition. Here we should recall Derrida, his ponderings on the ambiguity of the word counter, that for example, in French language, has 17 different meanings. So in the French dictionary Littré, the first one is in opposition to. Oh, okay, logical. The second one is expressing an idea of hostility, enmity, or blame. Starting with the third meaning, the term seems to lose its negative components. Likewise, it will signify a numerical comparison, similarly to a certain use of the English words for and against. Then it will mean in front of, making a juxtaposition, like in French, en face de. And moreover, it will mean near or close to, contre, marking proximity and contact, and so on and so on. Now we have the other 13 meanings, which are more precise and less important for us. So Derrida clearly saw this polysemy and the inner tension of the word counter, signifying more than opposition and confrontation, but also something facing and adjacent, a specific kind of contact and or juxtaposition. He saw also that the word counter can be a sign of exchange and relationship. As we have seen in Wallerstein's citation, the semi-peripheral countries are opposed to the core and the periphery, always seeking to trade and thus exchange with them. We see the point of the link between the two ideas, no? Beyond simple opposition and antagonism, semi-periphery is a space of proximity, of contact, of agonistic strivings, and not antagonisms only, a space in between, liminal, paradoxical space, a space with vague borders, an elusive zone on the continuum between the core and the periphery, as writes one Dutch political geographer, Kees Terlouw. I hope I pronounced this well. So it is striking then that the same conceptual images used here to describe the phenomenon of the semi-periphery appear when we read Maria Todorova's magnum opus, Imagining the Balkans. The Balkans, Todorova argues, are depicted theoretically and historically as neither fully Western nor entirely Eastern, existing instead in a liminal, in-between space that she characterizes as semi-colonial. This designation captures a complex geopolitical and cultural status of the region. It is partially integrated into the trajectory of European modernity, yet simultaneously positioned as an outsider, perpetually delayed or incomplete in its modernization. The liminality of the Balkans thus creates a dual vision. On the one hand, a region of backwardness, stagnation, and instability, and on the other, a site of potential transformation, serving as a bridge or a fault line between East and West. We could add to this division that the Balkans are also somehow between the North and the South, being neither fully on the global North nor fully on the global South. And as such, they reflect faithfully what Deleuze and Guattari call, when they describe the paradoxes of capitalism, the universal negative. In their being not, the Balkans represent a limit of space that, besides being the border between the larger blocks in the world system, is a space which is internally fragmented in small parcels, which shows yet again this, this double opposition, its peculiar counter character, paradigmatic for all semi-periphery, I would dare to claim. Balkans are thus a space of the universal negative and that of the shattered universal, to use here a notion beautifully coined by Jean-Claude Milner. Finally, this double opposition, or the counter space that the Balkans are, and which the semi-peripheral areas generally are, is the best seen in a double negation that is often used to describe them. We say that the semi-periphery is isn't this or isn't that, or we say that Balkans are neither this nor that. You can insert there a stereotype or a cliche of your choice. We say this much rather than saying that the semi-periphery or the Balkans are this as well as that. Okay. So to conclude, I will stress that the same way goes for the peninsula. It is not an island, but it is not fully a continent either, except for Europe, which somehow violently imposed itself as a continent, even if it is merely a peninsula of Eurasia, geographically speaking. A peninsula isn't this, and it isn't that. In Latin, peninsula means literally an almost island, Yet this almost can be understood as a double negation, neither an island nor a continent, but it can also be read as a limitrof, undetermined, open-ended space, or a place in which the deconstruction of the world system appears as an inherent feature. A peninsula is almost an island and not almost a continent, a small difference that seemed to reveal a huge emancipatory and subversive potential of the very notion of it. Furthermore, in the existent theoretical imagery, this seems like a precise and good fit. On the one hand, we have something called the continental philosophy, with its different versions of abstract universalisms. A philosophy that has grown from the European continent or peninsula, and therefore coming from the core. Basically, it comes from the core of the world system, no? Even if that is, I don't know, for better or for worse, not such a certainty today, in a changing world, no? But we could probably agree that most of these continental philosophies, or the continental philosophy as such, have substantially advanced the critical and the respective abilities of humanity, despite the political consequences, the horrible political consequences sometimes, and not without hitting a wall in a certain moment, okay? So on the one hand, the continent and the continental philosophy. On the other hand, we have something that Edouard Glissant called the archipelagic thinking, or the archipelagic multiverse, which proposed the relation with the capital R, creolization, opacity, and diversality. More recently, some colleagues from Southeast Asia founded a research group echoing Glissant's ideas on what they call the critical island studies, which is a good inspiration, I think. But what is left as an unemployed geophilosophical image between the critical and the decolonial philosophies, between the continent and the island or archipelago, is the image of a peninsula. And what better way and what better image one can find as a paradigm for a critical social theory coming from the semi-periphery. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Andrea, very much. It was very interesting, and I think it echoes about some things I will be talking about tomorrow. Okay, so to continue, our next speaker is David F.L. Gomez, and to say a bit about David. David is an assistant professor at the Law School of the Federal University of Minas Gerais. He holds an LLB and an LLM and a PhD in law, a bachelor degree in economics, and is currently a PhD candidate in economics at the University of Minas Gerais. He's a founding member of RealTech, the Latin American network of critical social studies. And today he'll be talking about the peripheral voices in critical theorizing towards universalism from the South. So we'll be hearing a bit more about a critical return to universalism, which I think Andrea probably announced today. David, the floor is yours. You have 30 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Milan Brozovic. So I'd like to thank Professor Vanya Grujic very much for all her efforts to make this event possible. I'd like also to thank all the colleagues for accepting the invitation. and I'm very glad to be here with you. Yeah, in fact, I'm very, very glad to be here with you. Um, so, um, my talk has this title: Peripheral Voices in Critical Theorizing Toward a Universalism from the South. The occasion of a dialogue between Serbia and Brazil about the critical theory and the periphery is, of course, an invitation to reflect on the very meaning of periphery. Where is it? Where does it come from? How is it constituted? But at the same time, it's also an invitation to think on critical theory, on the adjective critical that specifies this kind of theory. In this sense, first, I would like to briefly discuss the problematic way in which the name critical theory is generally utilized in academic debates around the world. Based on this reflection and adopting the wider concept critical theorizing, I'll then present the main three challenges with the corresponding strategies that, to me, must shape the critical attitude for recovering the expression used by Max Horkheimer in his founding paper, the critical attitude on the periphery or the south. And finally, I'll try to articulate these challenges and strategies in a proposal of a universalism from the south. So, the first point uh, refers to a kind of imperialistic epistemic effect of the name critical theory. In the paper I wrote for this event, I explain this point more extensively in a more detailed way. Here, for reasons of time, I'll go directly to the conclusions. Yeah, and to me, the point is critical theory has been a name generally reserved for authors and works from the north, from the center of the world, or at most for other authors and works that preserve an internal and strong link to those critical theorists from the center, to their concepts and their approaches. And even when we work with a broader sense of critical theory, which is not reduced to the Frankfurt School and encompass also authors like Michel Foucault or Judith Butler. Also, in this case, when we use critical theory in its broader sense, I think there is an imperialistic epistemic effect. So, as a consequence, many authors who do not fit into this canon of Northern critical theory are left out. Obviously, by saying that, I'm supposing, if not a very concept, at least a more relaxed notion of criticism. And to me, criticism is fundamentally about recognizing, after some deeper analysis, that our societies are impregnated with patterns of oppression, and that these patterns are neither natural nor random, but the result of a historically determined way to organize social relationships. However, the name critical theory, with its imperialistic epistemic effects, is a very consolidated name, with its more common and limiting meanings. Therefore, despite arguing for an enlargement of the notion of criticism, I'm not asking for a corresponding expansion in the use of this name. I prefer to speak of critical theorizing. Undoubtedly, it's just another name, of course, but one that allows us to move forward and not to remain caught in a kind of semantic trap. I mean, what is critical theory? What is not critical theory? Oh my God, my critical theory is better than your critical theory, and so on. I think it's many times, it's almost always is just a semantic battle. And I prefer to use this other expression, critical theorizing, that preserves also the the idea of Horkheimer of a critical attitude. The main point of the discussion about the critical theory to me is this point. Critical theory has to do with a critical attitude. So I prefer to talk about critical theorizing. First, the second point of this talk. So when someone decides to engage in critical theoretical reflection on the periphery, I think they face three possible challenges with three different corresponding strategies. First, critical theorizing on the periphery or in the South may involve having to deal with the challenge of how we can use critical concepts and critical theories developed in the center or the north to think about our peripheral problems. I think this one is the more common exercise of critical theory, of critical theorizing on the periphery. How we can use critical concepts like alienation, like domination, and so on to think about our context, our societies. So in this case, the point is how to use exactly, or at least predominantly, the same toolbox that one can find in the center to understand critically our social context. The second type of challenge to critical theorizing on the periphery involves, in turn, complementing the canon received from the center with authors, concepts, and theories from the periphery itself. Here, the point is how to add new tools to the toolbox, to the same toolbox, in order to make it more adequate to analyze peripheral specificities articulated with features globally shared. So Here I think of examples like the dependence theory, or like the royalty theory that Andrea Pernovici has mentioned. How to complement, for example, the critique of political economy by Karl Marx with other concepts, other reflections directly related to peripheral characteristics, peripheral features. So the same toolbox, but in this case, we add new tools to the same toolbox. Finally, a third type of challenge involves dialoguing with authors whose concepts and theories illuminate in many precious ways specific peripheral problems, but who have no strong relationship with the center's canon, or at least they are not known primarily as experts on some author from the center. So now the point is not just to add more and different tools once again to the same toolbox. The point is to foreground other possible toolbox for the task of critical theorizing on the periphery. So the point here is, who are the authors, for example, in Brazil or in Serbia, who are not known as critical theorists, who many times are not known beyond uh, Brazil or beyond Serbia, but who have many precious approaches about our social context in a critical perspective. And to me, the idea of critical theory, the name of critical theory, the battle for the name critical theory, many times left out many authors who do not fit exactly into the shape of the definition of critical theory in the center or the north. For didactic and explanatory reasons, I have presented three types of challenge in an order from the first to the third. But this is really just a didactic and explanatory device. To me, there is no hierarchy among them. There is not a way of critical theorizing. There is more legitimate than others. There is not a challenge or a strategy that is more difficult than others, and that because of this could be taken as more important than others. On the contrary, each of these three challenges must be understood as internally connected with a kind of meta challenge, precisely the challenge of attributing equal value to the three challenges. I mean, to the type of critical theorizing that corresponds to each of them. I mean, I'd like it to broaden the notion of criticism to include many authors who, in general, are not known as critical theorists. But from my point of view, they almost always can offer many interesting approach to our social context in a critical perspective. And with this, we can go to the third and last point. I'm not sure if the critical theory from the center or the north still can offer us critical perspective about our current world. So the third point of this talk. But why insist on the relevance of the center periphery divide or north-south split when talking about the critical theorizing? Why preserve this distinction? The reason for preserving it emerges when we broaden its meaning and align it with its origin as a theoretical distinction between center and periphery, emphasizes that there is not just a geographical difference, but a geopolitical, a geocultural, and a geoeconomic one. At least since Nikolai Bukharin and his discussion about imperialism, the notion of periphery refers to societies that are situated outside the places where the main global political and economic decisions are made, and that for this reason are societies that suffer the consequence of those decisions upon which they have little influence or no influence at all, come to express distinctive social features like poverty, hunger, private and state violence, unemployment, political instability, urban problems, environment devastation, spread of preventable diseases, and so on. With this comprehensive definition, four important points come to the fore. First, the notion of periphery and the center periphery split have an economic and political dimension that cannot be neglected. Second, this economic and political dimension does not exhaust the scope of that split. As Andrea Perunovic said, historical, cultural, and symbolic consequences in general with intertwine with economic and political ones. Third, if the periphery refers to societies situated outside the countries where the main global political and economic decisions are made, and that because of this fact exhibited social features very distinctive from those in the center, so it makes periphery a very comprehensive notion, and the center a very restricted one. Fourth, the fundamental task to legitimate the insistence on this split as a crucial theoretical pillar is to articulate the various dimensions to which the notion of periphery is in fact relevant. About the first 2 points, nowadays the term South or Global South is in many contexts more common than the term periphery. Vanya and I talked about this point last week. Here, I use them as synonym, and it seems to be loyal to the meaning of the expression Global South, employed initially by Karl Oglasbo in 1969. Notwithstanding mostly from the 1980s onwards, this expression is frequently used exactly to deny the pivotal relevance of the economic dimension of global asymmetric relationships. I mean, exactly to refuse the use of the term periphery or others like third world or underdeveloped countries. If you accept, on the one hand, that periphery and global south are notions impregnated with political economic meaning since their origins, but on the other hand, they cannot be reduced to their political economic dimension, we can keep using both as interchangeable. So for me, to me, periphery and global south are synonyms. Okay, both of them refer to political and economic dimension, but at the same time to historical, cultural, symbolic dimension. About the third point, the center or global north is composed in fact by a very small number of countries, the G7 and some others, and even so in a controversial way. Inside this small group, just a smaller portion of it effectively makes the fundamental political and economic decisions that impact all the world. A portion that does not even coincide with the G7. But the other central societies, because of various historical reasons, are very similar as societies to those of the real decisive countries. In the case of periphery or global south, the number of countries with their corresponding societies is enormous, basically the rest of the world. All of them share the characteristic of being affected by external decisions upon which they do not have any significant influence, and of being a society so different from those of the center. But beyond this shared feature, there are many distinctions among peripheral societies. Therefore, a way to recognize uh, the heterogeneity of periphery with its important implications is to distinguish two meanings for the concept of periphery and to complement it with the concept of semi-periphery. So, periphery in a broader sense is just the opposite to the center, encompassing the rest of the world. But in a stricter sense, it refers inside the periphery as a whole to societies that suffer most the effects of decisions made at the center, which is revealed by their social standards. In the stricter sense, it's complemented by the concept of semi-periphery, which refers to societies that do not belong to the center, but that do not suffer the impact from central decisions as the very peripheral ones. So once again, I think I'm very close to the arguments of Andrea Perunovic. Finally, about the fourth point, to try to deal with the task of articulating the various dimensions to which the notion of periphery and semi-periphery is relevant, I've been using the concept of a universalism from the South. Um, to me, the point is criticism, in a wide and loose definition, involves recognizing, after a profound analysis, patterns of social oppression that are historically constituted. So, the possibility of criticism is dependent on the access to social experiences that, once deeply analyzed, reveal the patterns of social oppression that a critical theorizing highlights and explains. So, without the access to those social experiences, criticism is not possible, or at least it becomes fragile, much less comprehensive, and frequently self referential. I think this is exactly the case of Frankfurt School for the last 4 decades. A kind of theoretical approach that has become almost completely self-referential. Here we have the main point. The structuring of the road based on the center-periphery split has generated in the center social experience that do not reflect, even to a minimal degree, the corresponding social experience around the world. We can think of examples related to working conditions and salaries, environmental protection, the multiple kinds of violence, housing conditions, health conditions, or the access to basic services in general. In some, it is as if the social experiences of the center or the north represent currently a moment of falsehood when we take the whole world into account. Immediately faced with this falsehood, criticism to me gets lost. This is the point. On the other hand, the moments of truth of the false social experience of the North are situated on the periphery or the South. For example, if we want to understand the conflicts regarding migration in Europe or in the USA, we must ask first about the work conditions and about the many kinds of war on the periphery in the South. Just one example. At the same time, social experiences that are indispensable to criticism encompasses experiences of struggle and resistance. So to me, criticism depends on the access of social experiences of oppression and the social experiences of struggles against oppression. And again, nowadays, the experiences of the North in this field represent just a moment of falsehood when all the world is taken into consideration. Without doubt, it was the strong experience of the struggles of the working class in the 19th century that allowed Karl Marx to elaborate his magisterial critique of political economy. In the same sense, it was the deep experience of the struggles of feminist movements that allowed, during the last decades in the North, the elaboration of many powerful theories criticizing gender oppression and its multiple guises. But now, and as a long and medium term consequence of the center periphery split, social experiences of struggle and resistance that can keep criticism alive and even invite for a renewal of critical theorizing are also located, at least predominantly, in the South. Among these experience of struggle of resistance, we have not just movements that vindicate standards of life similar to those of central societies. Of course, it's very important too, mainly when we're talking about the working conditions, housing conditions, food, health conditions, and so on. Beyond this, however, there are many social experiences that advocates a worldview completely different from that hegemonic in the North. Notions as good living or living well that emerged from indigenous traditions in the context of constitutional changes promoted by the so-called New Latin American constitutionalism offer, for example, an alternative way of thinking about our relationship with nature, moving away from the predatory conception consolidating in the North since the beginning of the modernity and many times coped uncritically by peripheral theories of development. This alternative conception is not an idea restricted to the South. It could perfectly helps. It could perfectly help also the North to rethink and reconfigure its practices. And with this kind of possibility, we have an initial image of the proposal of a universalism from the South. This image has 3 points of focus. First, social experiences of suffering in the South are the true side of mechanisms of oppression that operate globally, but that don't reveal their deep structure and function in the North. So, to think and to act in the South and from the South is to think about global issues and to act on global issues. Second, social experiences of struggle and resistance on the periphery or in the South at the beginning of the 21st century retain a force of truth that has been lost in the North, exactly because their struggles and modes of resistance in the North have faced in the last decades, with few exceptions, fundamentally moments of falsehood of the global mechanisms of oppression. Then, contemporary social experience of struggle and resistance in the South offer that indispensable base for an attempt of critical theorizing. Again, about specific, beg your pardon, again, about specific peripheral issues as well as about global issues. Third, the struggles and modes of resistance in the South do not just vindicate the possibility of entering in a best position into the sharing of the fruits of the progress that characterizes the central societies. They also offer alternative conceptions of social life, alternative conceptions that can serve as starting points to reconfigure modes of thinking and modes of acting, not just in the South, but one more time in the entire world. So, the mention of universalism has received a lot of criticism over the last decades. In general, these criticisms are legitimate insofar as they point against a kind of universalism imposed by the North throughout the building of modernity. A universalism that is, in fact, a provincialism universalized. But those criticisms, they lose their legitimacy when they refuse any kind of universal perspective, ending up aligning themselves with a defense of a multiplicity of provincialisms that claim to be justified by their mere existence. So, again, and for the last time, I'm very, very close to Andrea Perunovici again. And this defense of a multiplicity of provincialism is even more troubling in face of the fact that fundamental mechanisms of oppression are globally constituted, or at least globally articulated today. These global features of such mechanisms seem to make it impossible to confront them just from a disconnected multitude of local points of view. It's necessary to have some kind of universal perspective apt to offer a global alternative to globally organized standards of oppression. This universal perspective, however, cannot repeat the old universalism imposed by the North. On the one hand, for the reasons presented above, the North or the Center would hardly develop currently a critical understanding of the world that would make sense beyond its very narrow boundaries. On the other hand, if another version of universalism is really possible, it cannot be imposed. It must be built from critical debates in which common grounds and common horizons can emerge. This dialogue between Brazil and Serbia is therefore exactly the kind of initiative that, to me, can help to forge a universalism from the South. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, very much. We are all on time still. So the last speaker on this panel is Vanya Grujic. So Vanya Grujic is a visiting professor at the postgraduate interdisciplinary program for human rights at the Federal University of Pernambuco. She completed her doctoral studies in philosophy of law at the Faculty of Law, University of Brasilia, at the Center for European Law and Politics at the University of Bremen. With a CAPES DAD scholarship, she was also a CNPq postdoc junior fellow at the University of Brasilia. She holds a master's degree in politics and international affairs from the Faculty of Political Sciences at the University of Belgrade. And today, Vanya will be talking about peripheral experiences, deconstructing universalisms, a post-colonial critique. Vanya, the floor is yours. You have 30 minutes.
Thank you, Milan. Thank you, colleagues from the panel. When we started having this first conversation for this event, we had like two or three preparatory meetings, a lot of ideas that today we heard from Andrea and David appeared already on those meetings. And listening now the talks of my colleagues only like reinforce that we are in the same line of thought. So I will unfortunately repeat a lot of things that David and Andrea said, and I will try a little bit to take advantage of this position as the last one in the panel. Okay, before I start talking, I want to say two things, not to forget. And this is something I learned in Brazil, to say thank you for everyone. I think that it was an effort from all of us to be here today, and it is really for me, someone who is from Balkans and works in Brazil, this is also a special moment to have these two worlds somehow connected to talk about the peripheric, about the theory and critique coming from the periphery. So really happy that this happened, that this is happening, and really looking forward to hear all other talks tomorrow as well. The second thing I want to say is we all have these big words in our terms, in our titles: universalism, peripheric, critique. I have even experiences. So we are working with a very like problematic terms and very hardly to define or to deconstruct or to make position from which side to look terms, because they were always in the center of philosophy and social theory as well, especially the critical social theory. So I will, last week on the 17th, we had a preparatory meeting, David, Mari, me, and Gabrielle, where we made these talks in Portuguese with our students in Recife. And I prepared speech that I'm gonna more or less read today. But what I said then on the 17th, what I'm gonna say today as well, that the title of my work is full of these really strong words, but it's not doing justice to my talk so much, because I am actually not gonna be able to define or to really put in a concrete reflectional way all of these words that appear there. This is very initial, a segue of the way that I think it's leading the thought and the way we can think about the periphery and universalism, and what is the critique from the peripheric, which is maybe a little bit different from Andrea's speech. But I think that me and Andrea organized the text a little bit too similar. So I'm gonna start the same way, talking a little bit about universalism versus universality, how we can at least take a position among these two. Then I'm gonna talk in the second part about the relation between periphery and universalism. And at the end, hopefully I will try to come to some way of how to think critique from universalism, something that David also had in this last part of his speech. So when we talk about the universalism, universality, universalization, we see different, is it like a noun, a verb, etc. I think that there is something interesting that we can also think this process is different from the particular relation, the relation between the particular and universal. And here I refer, for example, to Laclau's temporalizing this relation, 3 moments. So the first one, I think Andrea mentioned something very similar. So we have antique philosophy, the relation between the particular universal is that of exclusion. The second, when we have the first mediation with the Christianity, the universal is embodied in the particular through a sequence of particular events in the Bible, etc. So the universal will of the God is connected to the people. I actually like more to think about delegation than Agamben uses here. And the third one for Laclau happens in modern rationalism. And this is when the theological mediation is abolished, and everything that exists should be transparent to the reason. And this is for Laclau where the Eurocentrism is born, the birth of Eurocentrism. Europe as the new universal, and the Europe founded like a new particular but named as universal. What I want to say here is that the problem of what we call Eurocentric definition of universal, something basically connected to also enlightenment, but the modern theory, the modernity, is not, it can be seen not as universal, the problem with the universal itself, but with this particular understanding of the relation between universal and particular. So sometimes, especially in the decolonial critical thought, this is confused with the rejection of any form of universal. And I agree strongly with my colleagues that more than ever, maybe we need this joint platform, right? Which might be still universalism or universality or whatever we might choose to use. Another point here also that I think problematic nowadays is that in politics we widely accept, and this is something like Laclau, Zizek, right, that left is interested in universal, like the universal emancipation, while the right is looking only for some particular affirmations. I think in the neoliberal politics that also doesn't stand anymore, and that also goes in hand with this need to return to this understanding also in the political fight of this universalization or universal. Okay, now I'm gonna like Andrea tried to put. It's really hard. I actually, my original intention was for this event to do some kind of literature review on what is universalism, and it would be like it's really hard. I wrote some pages, like it's full of dichotomies, a lot of external, internal, north, south, like center. Everything happens there, many of which Andrea mentioned. But I came in my what I use with my students, what I like, is actually Sheila Ben Habib's it's already from the 90s in her book, but she repeats it nowadays, uses some very short classification of the term universalism. She says it can stand for several clusters of views. So in these clusters of views, Ben Habib, she firstly puts these essentialists, right? The philosophical belief that there is some fundamental human nature, Hobbes, Hume, Kant, Rousseau at some moment. And then she talks the second one, and these are maybe the most complex one, but she puts them in the same category, justification universalists. So here we have hermeneutics like Gadamer, strong contextualists like Rorty, postmodern skeptic like Lyotard, power knowledge theories like Foucault, that all have these justificatory strategies. They all have this pretension to philosophical objectivity, but are trapped within this historical horizon and these different cultural social currents. Opposed to them, but still in the same group, she puts Carlotto Appel, Padham, Habermas, Dworkin, Nagel, John Rawls in some moments, that are not essentialists, but they share strong beliefs in the normative content of human reason. And then she has third and fourth, which is just like self-explanatory, like a moral based universalism, all human beings are moral equals, and legal universalism, all human beings are entitled with equal rights. So I thought that I always think that these clusters might be like flexible enough to also put some other types of universalism. Well, what Ben Habib here, and I'm going to mention her at the beginning, her model and Zizek's model is something maybe closest to what I read later together with Latin American, mostly post-colonial thinkers. So Ben Habib, she already in the 90s, she talks about the interactive universalism. She says, and this is just a short quote, recognizes the plurality of ways of being human and the differences among humans without, however, endorsing all these pluralities and differences as morally and politically valid. End of quote. So interactive universalism takes difference at the starting point for reflection and action. In this sense, universality is a regulative idea that does not deny our embodied and situated identity, but seeks to develop moral attitudes and foster political transformations capable of generating a standpoint acceptable to all. More or less, I think she wants to say that. So it is a concrete process. It comes from a concrete struggles and embodied selves, and she works within multiculturalism, the concrete other, contextual, post-metaphysical, moral universalism, based mostly on Hannah Arendt's also right to have rights. So this interactive universalism, even though very interesting and something that I always return to when I think about universalism, however, remains bound to the democracy of the national states, and even more in the latest work on Habib to this transnationalization of norms of law in the architecture and politics and processes of international protection of human rights. And it is still very, it still fosters this normative content of human reason that still is problematic. The second model is, I think that Andrea also mentions a bit, is Zizek, right? Slavoj Zizek, and when he talks about this radicalization of the European model of universality, universalization of the points of exclusions. So this concrete embodied universality, so it's literally the same words that Ben Habib uses, is the concretization of European universality through the points of exclusions that were excluded by that form of universality, through the subjects, basically, as the universal condition of inequality. For this kind of this type of universalism, the understanding of universalism, even though very interesting, it still, I believe, and of course this is very superficial here, it can imagine and talk in the name of sublatterns. It still does not explain how it could be developed from bottom up. And this is the core also problem with many decolonial thinking. So, but here what I want to say, the universal element is the first point, does not have to be considered as common points between two sources, two parties, theories, experiences, conditions, etc. It can be a product, and it disappears a bit in my title, of constructive reconstruction of different particular elements. The idea of constructive universalism I take from Uruguayan artist Joaquim Torres Garcia, who coins this universalismo constructivo, like the school from the South, as the idea to reconstruct pre-Columbian art and on one hand, and on the other hand, simultaneously reconstruct European art, like the way that is read, that is being incorporated to Latin American reality, and in the process of this reconstruction, constructing something as universal. Of course, this universal is very artistic, it's formal, etc., but I still really I really think there is a potential of further reading of this reconstructive idea of his. But this opening universalism for such activity, for this universalization of reconstructing construction, requires moving away from the juridical understanding, normative understanding, and this basis of universalism and universal reason. Universalism should be able to generate syncretic alignments. Such universalism, in order to remain radically open, means that it cannot be defined, that is completely dependable, contextual, and in that sense negative. It can only be envisaged as a dialogical montage movement that can, but it does not ought to produce certain structures, institutions, declarations, etc. And the fact that those might occur does not mean they should always remain in force. A sort of, and this is what I read with Mikhail Bakhtin, a sort of heteroglossia as a discursive diversity that foregrounds social or ethical differences, allowing their coexistence as tensions and conflicts. Something that Bakhtin sees, what I read in his work about the polyphonic novel, right? The minimalist understanding of universalism, on the one hand, allows us to radically opening to the contingency of conjunctures, to follow their flow, to trace the process to their formation, but without necessarily a real moment of closure, a moment where we can assert that something became universal or universal value or whatever we want to name it. No law, declaration, convention, a war, a peace, commercial deal, crisis, artistic school or movement, social movement, revolution should be understood as the points where the universal is born or created, no matter of their geopolitical characteristics. Only the process that allows that happens within those numerous points of contact is the process itself can be called universal. Okay, after trying to give this like opening universal to maybe some other more active way of understanding, the second part, what I want to see, how this can be tracked in towards the meaning, reconstructing the meaning of peripheries, and what universalism through this process can appear in those peripheries versus this like core or central meaning of universalism that we already heard about, right? So Andrea nicely put, I'm not gonna go into what Wallerstein, he even quotes him about this modern world system. I just want to have something here, like I think that peripheric is a very challenging word. I think it requires, I try to read a bit, but definitely not gonna talk about it today, to go into the geographic also notions, the difference between the territory, the zone, the area, etc. But what satisfied me to use for today is what Santiago Castro Gomez, Colombian critical theorist, he makes distinction between social zones and geographical zones, and these social zones are important. So, and it comes from Wallerstein, right? But I think that it can also appear something else that maybe Andrea didn't say, articulate so the way that I might put here. So social zones are a set of these hegemonic social relationships, primarily configured in the political framework of the national state, but whose structural function in some cases transcends the political limits it sets. Thus, for example, hegemonic social zones in 19th century European countries certainly worked as centers within their own societies, but their economic and cultural hegemony also extended to all peripheral social zones of the world system. And this division between the central, the core, and peripheral zone is not only external, but also internal. So it can also create the relationship between hegemonic and sub-Latin groups inside the national European states themselves. So it doesn't go only between this geographic center and periphery. That's why I think it's very complex. But let's move on. So peripheries, on also like now using maybe some other references, can be seen as areas where regimes of power that have historically and contextually developed to some degree in a separate manner as a resistance to the core, to the center. In this sense, peripheries articulate themselves not as a radical externality, like something radical external to the core, but as the inner part of what we can call now as the center, demonstrating how dispositives of power act differently outside of the center. I will just name two, like for the purpose of the event. We have a Brazilian sociologist, Luciano Oliveira from Recife, who will very nicely demonstrate that Brazil has never been a disciplinary society, for example, in a way that Foucault would say that France was, or some other European country. And we already talked that in the meetings before, how in Serbia social domination also functions different and is capable to reflect as domination and oppression. So what they produce in the periphery is a critique produces what in the periphery appears as incorporation of this critique in the center requires a rupture. It requires a big crisis. And I think this is very important. Center's core needs and creates periphery, economically, culturally, philosophically. We all know the history, but does not share its crisis and does not understand its crisis. So the question here, which I'm gonna relating to the universality, is how can universality arise from this, and I call here situational thought, that we many times call peripheral. The first thing, and briefly just here, to think about this question, we have to take a speculative distance. We have to make a distance from the terms such as concepts, universalism, and many other ones that we use from reading this continental philosophy. And if we want to understand some, for example, the resistances and fights of indigenous people in Brazil or in Latin America, the distance is even further. It doesn't mean separation, but it requires a distance. This is why genealogy, and here I think that Kopman's topology between subversive, vindicatory, and problematizing types of genealogy, philosophical archaeology, and history of ideas are so important. Taking a distance needs to appear as reaching some place that we relate to as unknown, to which we feel an urge, and this is a very important thing, and a necessity to move closer. It needs to correct, to intervene in something. On the Congress of Americanitas in Novi Sad this year, I met a researcher, Karolina Flipczak from Poland, and I learned from her work. She talks, her PhD is about peripheral philosophy. She talks about the situational universalism, quoting, which is a term coined by the Polish 19th century Polish philosopher Trentowski. That later Brzozowski, another Brzozowski, I think actually is the pronunciation, is gonna call the peripheric universalism as this situational thought. So the question here, and very interesting here, what Flipczak shows in her article, that Mexican philosopher Leopoldo Zea, when he talks about Asante project, Proyecto Asuntivo, in the Polish translation is translated as returning to itself, volver a uno mismo, right? So what Leopoldo Zea tries to think is how Latin American can reconcile with its past, how can establish its strong identity, regional identity, so as the project to return to its own reality, and from there build its own proper philosophy. Both Enrique Dussel and Leopoldo Zea show us that thinking particular, understanding itself, goes in two directions, and this is from Dussel, reading Zea. One that was concerned with elaborating a history of ideas of our America, and another that involved searching for an interpretation of this history, its meaning as totality and as part of universal history. End of quote. Peripheral always needs to be considered in its necessary condition, as liberated both ontologically and epistemologically and consequently politically. In this sense, peripheric thought is aware of its dependence, and it performs its liberation not in the negation of rejection of universalism, but in the act of returning to itself as a forgotten place or politically instrumentalized place in the history of European or Latin American also modern utopias. This return produces capacities for a true criticism, but what is different here is that this process is not worried about its universal potentialities. It has no universal intentions. What seems its fragility actually, I think, is the biggest potentiality. The initial impulse of the peripheric thought is not to understand the initial impulse is to understand itself, and in that sense it is already philosophical. Peripheric, finally, as something unknown to the other, but also to the peripheric subject as well. Something unfinished, something that after being recognized still finds the leftovers, the doveries, the restos, and the need to return to those. So summarizing this, I can say 3 points. In this initial impulse to understand itself, peripheric thought is one, extremely situational in its sense, and in that sense radically critical. In its effort to think itself as something that yet needs to be understood, it is capable, it needs to operate outside of already defined identities. Thus, and this is the second, it is reconstructing itself. Reconstructing itself requires a radical openness to truly other, to some radical alterity, let's say. And the third point, in its intentions to become political, it is radically open to new sensibilities and horizons, and in that sense, it can be radically transformative, as maybe a new type of politics. But let's see how that comes, and this is the last part of my speech. So how this understanding of peripherical talk and how we have these critical capacities or this rematerialization of the critique from the periphery, something I think that David puts as his critique of this canonical critical theory. So decolonial theory teaches us about the relation between coloniality and modernity, about the multiple modernities. Andrea already mentioned a lot, but I will go fastly here. Coloniality is the product of the Euro-Anglo-Saxon world, not only of capitalism, but of its philosophy, history, and science in general. And more importantly, not limited to the exterior or to itself, coloniality as a power works under the same principles inside of these core societies, creating, like I said, this rest, etc. Coloniality-driven politics continues to sustain itself in the modern philosophy. That is why coloniality remains depending on the form that operates not only of the clear division and unequal relation between the two parts through different types of expulsions, but also on the constant need to include what is external to it in order to justify its exclusion. Different aspects of peripheral lives are constantly, and realities are constantly being drawn inside of this form of power to be subsequently excluded as traditional, magical, violent, irrational, illegal, pre-conventional, barbarian, not historical, peninsular, etc. Decolonial theory also shows us how capitalism is finally racist, that it derivates and articulates its power around other spheres of human existence, such as knowledge, gender, and many other aspects of non-economic human and social life. What we can read from our colleagues from different peripheries, from the borderline thinking, Mignolo, is that our colleagues, intellectuals and social activists are talking and appointing this certain critique of capitalism and Euro-American power production long time ago. Many critique of that appears in the center already had appeared in the peripheral thought before. And this is not the statement for the plagiate. Quite on the contrary, it is the argument that reinforces the need, the true dependency of the peripheral experience, not within the subject-object dichotomy, but as the fact, the social reality that manages to dismantle the logics of power operating and distributing from the core, from the center, from somewhere that the periphery is in its historical definition defined as external, as non-belonging from which the bare idea of belonging depends, the act of negation that is necessary for the action of negation that allows affirmation. The postmodern, therefore, does not represent a historical superation, a dialectical overcoming of certain social and other conditions. Postmodernism for Latin American decolonial and postcolonial theory ought to guard contradictions alive, tensions coming from modernity. Its potential is in its reflexive capacity, in the refusal of the linear, hegemonic, and romanticized epistemologies and histories coming from the Eurocentric definition of modernity, but also a capacity to recognize and refuse the strategy of inventing itself as an exotic in the particular sphere of thought and existence, and as such somehow outside of modernity. This is what Castro Gomez presents about inventing Latino-Americanism, Latin America as something exotic, something outside of modernity, and something we have also in the title about Balkans and outside that uses also in his book. Here, going to the conclusion, I just think it's important to mention the critique of Hartenegri's book Empire. Both Castro Gomez and Mignolo demonstrate that the postmodern imagination of these authors, Hartenegri, means a post-coloniality as a historical overcoming of coloniality. Like that, it clearly illustrates an act of transformation of coloniality, or as Mignolo puts it, not the end of coloniality, but its reorganization, a postmodern reorganization. Mignolo adds, a new, up-to-date forms of coloniality that correspond to the postmodern stage of Occidental history. So new postmodern forms of coloniality. To this, I will just add the intersectionality also is something that is in the center of the peripheral critique. That is the peripheral critique that develops that center fails to produce, and that Latin American feminists taught us that we can and need to think about gender through its encounter with other social norms much before the European or North American feminists even coined the word intersectionality. They thought about intersectionality before the term was coined. And here, just like a brief example and wrapping up, really finishing, this is like, I would just like to try to give two simple categories of the critique coming from Brazil, in my experience, mostly from my students who research critique on the periphery, as an example of this periphery critique. The first is critique stemming from the understanding of the minimal formal conditions of social justice. This is a critique built on this understanding of constitutional, regional, international, legal protection and the meanings of social justice. So the effective, what is the effective power of these norms. And the second one is critique stemming from the understanding of the minimum conditions of life capable of surviving. This is a critique built on scandalizing different types of injustices. And here I will just say two. The first is embodied critique as bodily experience, and the second, critique as an act of survival. So critical theory, the act of producing social critique became an act of survival, detaching itself from certain utopias of a superior level of thought that it had before. It still requires courage, but that courage is now more impulsed by the survival instincts. Its immanence in the resistance, in the social fights that can surge at any place, at any time, makes social critique perhaps more than ever actual and dependent on the particularities that understand and develop themselves in relation to this here and now. And here in Brazil, just a few weeks ago, after a police riot in two neighborhoods of Rio de Janeiro, when community members were collecting bodies from the nearby forest area, bodies abandoned by police, many of which were tortured, almost all of them young and black men, none of which was under the arrest warrant. They were not collecting those corpses in order to claim more specific rights. They were doing that as an act of survival, exposing killed bodies on the public square as the only strategy to protect their own lives. They provoke, they call, they evoke for the politics of life. The pleas of the mothers on that square was not for the justice for their sons, the killed sons, but for the survival of the other sons and the other ones who remained alive. So with this example, I will finish my talk and sorry if I went over 30 minutes, Milan. Thank you.
No problem, Vanya. Thank you very much. So that's it for the talks for this panel for today as well. I'm opening the floor for discussion. We have a 30-minute discussion planned. So please, everyone who wants to ask our presenters some questions or maybe have some ideas to add, etc., please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I have a first question. Okay. Okay.
Yes, David, please.
Yeah. Vanya, I'd like to hear a little bit more about this relationship between the construction, and the reconstruction. Okay. Maybe I'll have a second question, but first of all, I'd like to hear a little bit more about this relationship for you.
Okay, do you want to collect more questions, Milan, if there are some more, or shall I? Because I have also some brief
I think we can try to, since it's pretty difficult to moderate online like this, maybe we can just try to answer right away after the question.
Okay, and then I can make my question if nobody rises.
Yeah.
Thank you, David, for this. This is actually important because in my title I put deconstructing, but it's a mistake. It's reconstructing. It's supposed to be R, right? So and this reconstructive universalism, so this like containing reconstruction in order to construct, it comes from this artistic movement from Uruguay, from the 20th century, from the 1940. It is very interesting. There is a book called Universalismo Constructivo from Joaquin Torres Garcia that I advanced quite a lot. So he was a modern artist from being in Europe, Spanish, Uruguayan, and then he returns to Uruguay and he starts to think it's possible to have modern art in Latin America. We don't have just to use the Cubism, Neoclassicism, like incorporate all these styles from Europe. We need to reconstruct our pre-Columbian, so the indigenous mostly, let's say, in Uruguay is a little bit different maybe than in Brazil. We need to reconstruct our aesthetics, pre-Columbian aesthetics, and like in that sense, like artistic possibilities, and also to reconstruct European influences, the way as we read them according to these pre-Columbian aesthetics. And he sees that as a way to develop a proper Latin American constructivism. Of course, constructivism here is taught in the artistic way, so it's about the form, it's about openness, etc. But I strongly feel it's, for me, was a very fruitful metaphor for this idea of going back to itself, that requires that is already intervening, not only about like discovering some realities like Zea thoughts, but it also is already constructing another idea of universalism. So, and I think that's where the critique is so important. And that's why critique in Latin America is so different than in the center. So, I think it's the deconstruction here actually is out of the, it's just about the letter that changed everything, which is already saying a lot about deconstruction. But I hope I answered. I can,
Okay, Vanya, ask your question and then Gabriel can ask his.
Yeah, okay, I can just like, I wanted to ask question to Andrea. I like this metaphor about island studies metaphor, these readings that you brought, that I would like also to follow up on them, like the island study, continental philosophy. Well, the first thing is that at some moment you say between the critical and decolonial philosophers. My question is, do you think the decolonial philosophers are not critical, or this end means end, like they are, like decolonial are critical philosophers? And the second one about the peninsular as how we say on the border of the empire. I mean, like in Serbian, I would say like echoing between both sides, right? Like but this peninsular would it be something between continental and island studies, following the geographical metaphor? Just that.
So should I respond right away, I imagine? Yes, thank you, Vanya. Of course, on this first question, I think my syntax was not so well. Of course, I do not think that decolonial thinkers are not critical. That was a conjunction, so they are critical and decolonial on the one side. But maybe I wanted to put some distinction between, let's say, the traditional theory which didn't take into the account so much colonialism and the one. So, of course, the first one is not true. I'm not making a distinction between critical and decolonial theory. Of course, decolonial theory is critical, and every decent critical theory nowadays must be decolonial also. But yeah, there was also times when theory wasn't so to say colonially aware of that problem. And yeah, and the second question, yeah, really, I thought of the peninsula as an image of thought, you know. This almost moment was very important for me. This non-definable moment was somehow connecting both the idea of the semi-periphery and the Balkans, like as a non-identifiable, as a non, let's say, determined some kind of a space. And yeah, and I didn't want it to to use it as a metaphor. I really wanted to use it as a concept that represents the other concept in a non-precise way. Let's say that, like David was talking about, filling up, like adding new elements to the box, that to the toolbox that the critical theory is, and that was my humble try to give yet another new concept in it. As you know, basically I'm a Deleuzian, so for me philosophy means creating concepts. Okay. I will have some questions for you, but we have a row and for David also. But first, Gabriel,
then Mariana, and then Andrea. You can ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your presentations. It was great. Great. Thank you, Andrea. I had already had the chance of congratulating Davi and Vanya last week. So thank you very much for your beautiful presentation. I think I have two questions for the three of you, if you want to weigh in any sort of way. There are two things there that been somehow it's some sort of problem that I have with the discussions that we have. The first one is the idea of a critique and critical theory. So this notion of critique, hearing you guys, especially David's presentation, I'm wondering if if critique is not the most European concepts of all. And in some sort of way, European philosophy is critical philosophy. And this is why this otherness that you're evoking cannot be reduced to critique. As Derrida once said, critique is a project of delimitation, right? Of imposing limits. And this is my perception. I think these other philosophers or thinkers, whatever we want to call it, maybe they're working some other ways of transforming and other ways of thinking about transformation that is beyond critique. So this is the first question. Second question, the very idea of Europe. Although you guys are talking about Eurocentrism a lot and Eurocentric thought, I'm under the impression that most of the philosophy that we're talking about here was not thought or handed in the way of an European philosophy, but rather in a nationalistic philosophy, German philosophy, French philosophy, English philosophy, American philosophy. And this, in my opinion, this has a reason. The reason is that philosophical institutions are national, and and nationalism has to do with philosophy as well. So I want to hear I want to see if you guys agree with me on that. I'm not denying that something like an European philosophy has emerged, and Eurocentrism is definitely a good critique. But in my opinion, consciously, those philosophers were doing national philosophy in Fichtean terms. And I want to hear you guys what you are proposing or what we are proposing has to do with the critique, quote unquote, of this nationalistic view, or resisting European philosophy means necessarily creating some sort of import substitution and creating national markets for our philosophies. Is this what we're talking about here, or are we thinking something else? Liberalizing philosophy and doing world philosophy, or regional philosophy, or South philosophy? What is this? In terms of institutions, what are we talking about?
Mariana, you can ask your question now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your talks. And as I was listening to you, I was thinking about maybe some common points in your talks. What I could grasp, Andrea started talking about universalism and how it might have become a ghost, spectral universalism. As we try to send it away, it becomes something else and it haunts us, as I have figured, or something like that. And Davi and Vanya had a more post-colonial critique to universalism. But as I have heard you, I think you don't want to abandon universalism. You want to think about other kinds of universalism. I think it might in three different manners. But what was I thinking? What kind of universalism you don't want anymore? And that's my question for you. Maybe what you have in common is that there is a kind of universalism that the three of you don't want. And I think it might be something called like an European abstract universalism, something like very maybe close to contemporary philosophers like Jürgen Habermas. We don't want to defend the kind of the model of human rights as Habermas defended, because it comes from a kind of perspective about human, the one that creates fields of unhumans. And that's the trick of Habermasian universalism. Maybe that's what you guys don't want. That's what I think we can find some common ground if we actually at least know what you don't want. And as I was here, especially Vanya's talk, the last part of your talk, Vanya, and that's the part we have so much in common. She grasped some idea from Luciano Oliveira and Brazilian critical criminology. And I think when you talk to Brazilian criminologists and we start to go very deep in Foucaultian or philosophical ideas, they say they kind of have no patience. Because they have some reason for having no patience with us, because we're dealing with people that are about to die. And we kind of engage in a critical view of human rights, and they are very concerned about the survivability of those people. And I think that's what Vanya grasped, and I'm also very interested in that. What human rights become in some field of practices, and how much human rights has to do with trying to keep people alive, and there is I'm concerned about Gabriel's said about how European the word critical is, that staying alive, survive in Rio de Janeiro, survive the violence in Rio de Janeiro, it has some political significance. So I think those bodies that insist, I think that's the word, Jesus used the word, insist and being alive when they're all things considered, they are about to die, that there is a political action on it. So what human rights become in this very, very practical and very concrete situation, I think that might be interesting trail to follow. Well, but my question was really about what kind of universalism the three of you don't want. Maybe there we can find some sort of common ground. Thank you.
Okay, then maybe Andrea, you can answer the question and ask your own question, and then maybe Vanya and David can answer the question as well. Mariana's and others. So
I will just answer try to see what to do with all of this, because it's very valuable and rich, and then we will see for my questions it's less important. I think that your two questions are quite somehow interconnected, you know, and I'm really appreciative of this care of notions that Vanya showed, and then you both are showing now. It's very, I think it's very important. Like just about a few words about the philosophical institutions as national that Gabriel mentioned. I think you're completely right. We did, I think, a slight injustice to the idea of Europe. I'm not, just to say really politically, I'm not against the idea of Europe. Maybe the European Union is problematic, of course, especially nowadays. But on that account, I'm quite on the side of Etienne Balibar and his idea of Europe and citizenship and everything. I think there are many great things there. And of course, what's worse, then there is a part of the answer to Mariana now. What's worse than national universalism, you know? All the extreme right politics are built on national abstract universalism that we have experienced in the Balkans in a tremendously exaggerated way. After the war in the 90s here, when Yugoslavia broke down, we had the rise of national universalisms that were so derooted from any reality whatsoever that people started inventing languages, you know? Like we always perfectly understand each other, Serbians, Croats, Bosnians, and everybody then when the Yugoslavia broke down, oh, let's make some universalisms quickly to affirm our national position. We need our language, we need our mythology, we need our universal history, let's do it, you know? So that is the problem of Europe as well, because Balkans are some kind of unconscious of Europe. It's a simplification, but somewhere where the unconscious drives of Europe are being executed before, like a test balloons, a test drive that we have here always before it comes elsewhere, in the let's say this European context. That is one. So that is kind of responding, I think, from my side to Mariana's question, and that is, we don't want like dominant universalism. We don't want exclusive universalism. We don't want universalism that are hindering inequality, But when you stripe all that down, then with what you're left, because the idea of the universal is like, for the better or for the worse, coming from that tradition, like what, Greco-Roman, or somebody call it Judeo-Christian. And I don't. I'm really talking about the ancient time, the classics. Like universal, which is meaning Latin the oneness, the idea of oneness, and then you have the Greek katolo, which is the idea of totality. And in both you have, and then enlightenment with the idea of light, all those were somehow exclusive in a certain sense. That's why I think that the post-colonial thinkers are really interesting with the idea of multiverse, of interverse, of all these concepts that somehow, just remove that give us the versus, some kind of a juxtaposition. But from my point of view, I think these are the things that we really don't want. And then the other problem that I tried to point out in my text was that like some thinkers, like, I don't know, Rorty is quite prominent there. Some other, they just told like, oh no, universal is, it's a no. We shouldn't use that word anymore. We shouldn't go into that, and this is some like dirty dominant word that we should forget. But then I must repeat, this stayed and continued to, the machine was still working, and still executing exclusion and still raising inequalities and everything. So, like, we should be aware of the negative sides of the universal and of the positive ones, and bring them somehow into the reflection, like, I think that's why I was insisting on that semi-peripheral perspective, and I will stop here, because very intimately I would like to see the whole world become a semi-periphery, because if the whole world became semi-periphery, there will be no core and no periphery left standing, we would be more equal, so to say, and maybe that could lead us to some kind of a better society. But we need to, and then also, of course, national things, like what Gabriel told. Of course, the nation is a problem also, because, in my town there is a core, a periphery, in every town, and that is a problem that Vanya was mentioning. What are we talking about? Zones, territories, spaces, places. It's so complex and so rich, but we will have time to work on that together, I hope so. I'm sorry if I took too much time.
Okay, then for the sake of time, maybe Vanya and David, you can give your answers and comments, and I think that we are out of time then.
Okay, I think that Andrea, like, oh, a lot of new stuff came out now. It's connected, all questions. like from Mariana and from Gabriel. Thank you for the questions. And actually, this question that Gabriel also gave last week, what is what we think when we say critique, right? Like isn't all philosophy reflexive? Is critique like being reflexive, like to reflect on something, to speculative, like in a Hegelian also? Like, yes, it is. Like we have this writing also that David says critique as an attitude, right? That Foucault, for example, when he reads about Kant, actuality, attitude, courage, etc. But what for me it's interesting here, and what I think that there is some potentiality, let's say, in this peripheral critique, at least what I try to put in this last part, is this different, like the critique is always connected to act of violence in universalism. So in producing, for example, some articulating something as universal through this process of critique or this process of overcoming certain obstacles in the modern, in the science, in the rationalism, etc., it's always a sort of hidden violence. It's based on violence, right? So this reflexivity, it's violent, no? But when we think about critique as act, as a body, as embodied, as performative, and that's entering what Mari said, what I think is it happens also in the semi-periphery. It happens in Serbia. I mean, like we have bodies under the tons of concrete crashed last year. So it's not only about the scandalizing of something. It's about the critique that the bodily experience, a very contingent, non-controllable moment of a social production that can produce something that is a pure critique, let's say, like it can be grasped by critical theory or it can be grasped by us, but it happens in this very spontaneous, in a way, like that I cited at the end, survival instinct sometimes, right? So that is also like many times when we talk about this performativity, Judith Butler, feminists like Laila Gonzalez, all of these ones, they also talk about that, not to talk about transgender people, etc. So we have this, for example, for me, that's also critique. So it doesn't have to be only like in these limits of the philosophy, like continental philosophy, like now I'm all in these geographical terms. But then this other thing, I think that Andrea already answered most of the things about the national philosophies. There is a very nice small text, The Theory of Criticism of Walter Benjamin, that talks about that I was rereading the other day. But I want to say here that also we have in Balkans, I think it was very straightforward when I was living there, is the problem with this European universalism in the way of abstract values. And that's where maybe Habermas also comes, and that's the universally, I think it doesn't work. So we do have some values that are very nice, but they become abstract values when they appear on periphery. They are not concrete. They just like, they don't allow the antagonism, the clash with the reality. They just demand to be incorporating through the norms, through the laws, through the political process itself. And I think that's the kind of universalism also that I would discard as something that I don't want. And I think at the end, just I want to say that common ground, maybe universalism as a common ground, as a practice, where we can think about some global resistances, or where we can think about models that we can use for this network of collaboration, of resistances, of something that can be created like on the common ground within all this pluriverse, within all this dialogical like polyphony, etc., is maybe the most, it is very open, but it's the way that I would think it's necessary nowadays, like more than before. And I just gonna finish here. I had it here open because I saw it before the event. It's from Terry Eagleton. He says this, and maybe something that is for all of us. The modern criticism was born from a fight against the absolutist state, but has resulted in a group of individuals rereading other people's books. So this is also the critique of what we mean by criticism. It requires politics, it requires action, and it requires the collaborations that I might be at the end something we can think as a common ground. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, David, if you have anything to say, and I think
Okay. Okay, so Gabriel, so as always, very interesting questions. But to me, I think the concept of nation and of nationalism is a very European concept. Okay, but I think that it can operate at different levels. So to me, the project of European Union is a kind of attempt to rebuild a nationalism beyond the restricted space of a nation state. So I think we can say the same thing about philosophy. I agree with you that we can identify national projects of philosophy in Germany and England and France. But I think that at the same time, we can also identify an European project of philosophy that emerges among this nationalist project of philosophy. Okay, and so about the question of nationalism and philosophy, I would say that. And to me, it is related with your other question about the critique. Is critique a very specific way of making philosophy of Europe, from Europe? Maybe I could agree with you until Marx. I mean, between Kant and Marx. But I think something very important changed between Marx and Horkheimer. More specifically, between the last thesis against Feuerbach by Marx and the famous paper Critical Theory and Traditional Theory by Horkheimer. Since that moment on, I think critique become another thing. And in this sense, I think the best definition of this other thing is the definition of Horkheimer, a critical attitude. And as a proposal of a critical attitude, I think that the critique is no more just an European concept. And in this sense, I'm wondering if your both questions are not strictly internally related. I mean, isn't the question about critique as an European way of making philosophy? Isn't this question not a nationalist question? Because I think, at least since Horkheimer, the idea of critique is broader than just an European project. And in this sense, it invites exactly the kind of discussion we are having this event. but you can answer me tomorrow. I'd like to hear you about this point. Isn't the question about critique as an European project of philosophy a nationalist conception of philosophy once again? But tomorrow we talk about this.
Okay, then I think we've reached the end of today's panel and the discussion. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for 3 wonderful talks and a wonderful discussion. I guess we will see each other tomorrow at, well, in Belgrade, it's 1300 hours, and Brazil, that's, I don't know exactly when, but I guess we'll see each other tomorrow to talk. We have 2 panels, one at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and the other one at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So thank you again and see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone. So it was great.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you. See you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
David?
Just a minute.
Ah,
Okay, I ended the transmission.